Come on, Episcopalians, that hymn was pretty jumpy. Looking around, it's all these stoic faces. We got to wake up. This is an awesome time we're in as we're in this big Exodus reading. As we began last week, and we're in our chapter 3 today. So you get a quiz. Last week I told you as we read through the Exodus story, you're to ask yourself 2 questions. What's the first one? Who am I, right? So every time you hear the story proclaimed, who are you in the story? And number 2, what would you do? What would you do? How would you respond? How would you respond like the various people in the various passages that we read? We are going to be looking at Exodus almost like a prism from all kinds of angles. So at the Wednesday Bible study, and if you can't make Wednesday Bible study, there's a way for you to participate. More to come on that during the announcements. We're going to be going a very linear approach to Exodus. We'll be going step by step, looking at the deep theology that's present and within all of those writings. Thursday evening, same thing. 7:30, if you could be there, awesome. If not, there's a way for you to participate. More to come. It's my little announcement teaser trailer. But we're going to be looking at the liturgies of the tabernacle and the temple. So you're going to see Exodus through all the worship experiences that are occurring. But on Sundays, we're really going to tackle how you're handling this personally. Turn to page 7. Now, you heard this passage about the burning bush, right? You could probably even quote it to some degree. Moses is out in the fields. He sees a burning bush. Most of you in your heads are seeing Charlton Heston. You're seeing the whole scene, right? We get so kind of wrapped up into the miraculous experience of God speaking to Moses in the burning bush. He had to take off his shoes because the ground was holy. This is where I wish our lectionary was a little bit thicker, our readings. Because really this story is in the middle of 2 bookends that begin at the end of chapter 2 and go all the way through chapter 3. And really it should be called, How Not to Act When God Calls You. How not to act when God calls you. We get kind of roped up into the burning bush, but let's look at how God calls. This is addressed to every single person in this room, by the way. Last week we talked about the name Moses. What's the name of Moses mean? Drawn out. You're all paying attention. Gold star, right? We talked about how he was drawn out of the Nile and given a task. Every single person in this room is a Moses. You have been drawn out of the waters of baptism for a particular reason and a particular call on your life. The end of chapter 2, we pick up where we left off last week. Moses is in the house of Pharaoh. He's raised as an Egyptian, not as an Israelite. Anyone know how long he was in the house of Pharaoh? 40 years. It's not just a quick time. He's there for a long time and pretty separated at this point from the Israelite community and being fully raised as an Egyptian. One day he leaves the palace and he goes into the streets and he sees an Egyptian horribly treating a fellow Israelite. And he gets righteous anger. And anyone know what he does? Kills him. Wrap your head around that. Moses murders someone and buries him in the sand to hide what he did. A lot of times when God puts a call in our life, and God has a call in every single one of our lives, one of the first things we do is run before God. We run before him. We take matters into our own hands. We know better, right? We know how to take care of this right now. God's taken a long time answering this, so I'm just going to roll with it. I always like to tell people, the job of Messiah is fulfilled, and it is not you. The role of the Messiah has been taken. You are not he. So often in our lives, we like to play God like that. God, you're taking a long time. I'm just going to roll with it. That's what Moses did. He sees his people in slavery, and he takes matters into his hand. And you notice when we take matters into our own hands, it gets ugly. Then what does he do? He books it. Sometimes, number 2, we run when God calls us. We run. Moses didn't feel accepted by the Egyptians anymore because Pharaoh heard what he did and he was out for Moses. He goes into the streets. He sees 2 Israelites battling with each other. Why are you fighting with each other? And they start to josh him. Who appointed you ruler of us? You're going to do what you did to the Egyptian to us? So he runs into the wilderness, where he runs from what the Lord is actually calling him to do, to start his own life on his own terms. He meets Jethro, who's a priest of Midian. He eventually marries one of his daughters, and he becomes a shepherd of Jethro's flock. Anyone know for how long? Another 40 years. 40 years of running. 40 years of running. When the burning bush event happens, Moses is 80. Moses is not a young person. He's 80. Number 3, wrong way to do it when God calls us. Look at that first paragraph on page 7. When God calls you, don't expect the burning bush to be right in front of your face. That's how we want it. God, if you would just pick up the phone and physically tell me what I'm supposed to do, then I'll do it. God never operates that way. God never operated that way with Moses. Look in the middle of it. When the Lord appears to him in the burning bush, Moses looked, and the bush was blazing and yet not consumed. And Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. I have to turn aside, which means the burning bush wasn't right in front of him. The burning bush was in his peripheral vision. He had to physically turn from his own stuff and look. When God calls you, God is a gentleman, is never going to impose himself on your will. God, if you're expecting God to drop something right in your face to make it clear to you what you're supposed to do, good luck. It's never happened in history. Because God wants you to choose it freely. And so he's going to drop it in your peripheral vision. The burning bush wasn't right there. It was off to the side that Moses had to turn and look at it. Me as a priest, I knew since I was a little boy I wanted to be a priest. I've been saying Mass. I tell people I've been saying Mass since I was 5. In my bedroom, my brothers were my acolytes. I was yelling at them then for messing up the rubrics with my little I use Doritos, by the way. Doritos and Kool-Aid for Eucharist. But it wasn't until God dropped the burning bush in my peripheral vision that people came up to me and said, have you ever thought about being a priest? It was then that I was able to turn and actually discern what God's asking me to do. But believe me, there wasn't a sign that dropped from the heavens. God finally speaks to Moses. And then number 4, don't argue with God. This is where I wish our lectionary was longer, because if you would read, this goes up to verse 13, but if you would read the full chapter 3 of Exodus, Moses does what every single person in this room does. Moses, I've heard my people cry. I am going to free them, and you are going to go to Pharaoh. And what's Moses say? Who am I? Who am I to go to Pharaoh? Wrong man, God. Then he goes further. God starts explaining why he's the person. I don't know if you're aware of this, God. It's not in here, but it's in this chapter 3. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm slow to speech and thought. Moses actually had a speech impediment. You've chosen the wrong guy again. God, what if I do this and they don't listen to me? And then finally at the end of it, he just says, please, God, choose someone else. You ever been there? Oh yeah, we all have been there. Notice how we like to tell the Almighty God, who gave his name as the great I am who am, which means he is pure being, pure existence, all-knowing, all-powerful creator. The person who made every cell in your body, who knows you better know than yourself. We approach him and say, I think you made a bad judgment on this one. Once again, the role of Messiah and God has been fulfilled, and it is not you. I can assure you the God who made the cells in your body knows who he has chosen and why he has chosen that person. It's okay to argue back with him, because that's how we get to know ourselves. But I could assure you, the call on your life is for you. It's not for the person sitting next to you. It's definitely not mine. It's your own. God has chosen the right person, so don't fight. Well, what do? People always come up to me and say, I don't know. I don't know what God has in store for me. How do I do this? One thing that always struck me about this Moses story, the bush appears. If you look in the middle of it, it says, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is burned up. When the Lord saw that Moses turned aside to see, God called out to him. If you notice, God hasn't spoken to Moses this whole time. Not when he was taken up with the Nile, not in the 40 years that he was in the house of Pharaoh, not that he was in the 40 years being a shepherd in Midian, but it was only when finally Moses stopped, got off his own way, and turned to face God that God actually spoke to him. So often we as Christians want to be spiritually spoon-fed. We want to have a nice little spiritual diaper on, and we want God to bottle feed us. But God will speak to you when you finally get off your own stuff and you spend quiet time and turn and face him. A lot of times people come up to me with all these questions of why. Why does God do that? Why does God do that? What does God want me to do? And then I always say, I don't know. Have you asked him? When was the last time in your life you got off your own road and turned and faced him? And spent time in dialogue just as Moses did. These stories just aren't beautiful things to put in movies. The reason why they're inspired is because God is still speaking to us. You all are Moses in many ways. You have all been given a task, you've all been drawn out by the waters of baptism, and you all have a call on your life. When will you get out of your way and turn and face the burning bush and ask him who you are?